They called her unwanted, like that was enough to make it true. The dust hung low over Red Hollow that morning, heat already rising off the boards before the sun had fully climbed, and every boot in the street seemed to shift just enough to keep its distance from the girl standing alone by the well. Her dress was simple, worn by miles of travel, dark hair pulled back with a strip of leather that had seen better days, and in her eyes there was no plea, no anger. Just a stillness that didn't belong in a town that loud. Someone muttered something under their breath, then louder, then another voice joined, and soon the air filled with that familiar tone frontier towns learn too easily, the sound of people agreeing on something without ever asking if it was right. Ethan Cole watched from the shade of the saloon porch, one shoulder resting against a warped post, hat low, saying nothing, because men like him learned early that silence kept you alive longer than opinions. He'd seen travelers come and go, seen good folks turned away for less, but there was something about the way she stood there, not shrinking, not fighting, just existing in a place that had already decided she didn't belong, that settled heavy in his chest like a stone you couldn't spit out. The sheriff stood near the steps, thumb hooked in his belt, eyes flicking between the crowd and the girl, calculating, waiting for the mood to settle into something he could pretend was law. "You best keep moving," someone called out, and a few others nodded like that made it official. Like a town could decide a person's worth before breakfast. The girl didn't move, not even an inch, and that's when the tension shifted, quiet but sharp, like the moment before a storm breaks across open land. Ethan straightened, slow, deliberate, boots hitting the dirt with a dull thud that somehow cut through the noise, and for a second, just a second, the whole street seemed to notice without knowing why. He walked past the well, past the stairs, past the weight of 100 unspoken warnings, until he stood beside her close enough to hear her breathing, steady, controlled, like she'd already made peace with whatever came next. He didn't ask her name, didn't look for permission, just reached out and took her hand, rough fingers closing around hers like it was the simplest thing in the world. The crowd fell quiet first, then came the whispers, sharper now, edged with something that wasn't just anger, because what unsettled them wasn't her anymore, it was him. "You're making a mistake, Cole," the sheriff said, voice low but carrying, the kind of warning meant to sound like advice. Ethan didn't answer, didn't even turn his head, just stood there, hand in hers, like he'd already counted the cost. And found it acceptable. Somewhere down the street, a door creaked open, then shut again, and the sound echoed longer than it should have, stretching the silence into something thick and heavy. The girl finally looked at him then, just once, a flicker of something crossing her face too fast to name, and Ethan felt it, that shift, like the ground had moved a fraction under his boots. Behind them, the town began to breathe again, but not the same way. Not easy, not certain, because choices like that didn't just end, they traveled, they spread, they called things into motion that no one could call back, and out beyond the last fence line, where the land rolled into open hills and the wind carried stories farther than any man could ride in a day, something had already heard. The hand he held did not tremble, not when the whispers grew louder, not when boots scraped against dry boards and then shifted their weight like they were deciding something that had already been decided. Ethan felt it then, not fear, not yet, but the turning of something inside the town, like a wheel that once set in motion did not stop for any one man. And he knew Red Hollow well enough to understand what came next would not be spoken out loud, not at first. The sheriff exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing just enough to mark a line without drawing it, and the people followed that silence the way cattle follow a fence, unsure why, but unwilling to cross it. "You can stay," the sheriff said finally, though it did not sound like permission, more like a sentence carried out in advance. "But do not expect anything from anyone here." That was how it began, not with shouting, not with force, but with absence. By noon, no one would sell them water, not a cup, not a drop, the well rope left coiled as if it had never been used. By afternoon, doors that had always opened for Ethan stayed closed, faces turning away before his shadow could reach them. The sun climbed high, pressing heat into the dirt until it cracked underfoot, and still he did not let go of her hand until they reached the edge of town where the last fence leaned tired against the wind. Only then did he release her, slow, deliberate, as if letting go too quickly might undo something that had already taken root. She looked at him again, longer this time, eyes studying him the way one might study a path they had not planned to walk. "You did not have to do that," she said, her voice steady, carrying the quiet weight of someone used to being unheard. Ethan adjusted his hat, gaze drifting toward the open land beyond, where the horizon stretched wide and indifferent. "Seems like I did," he answered, simple, like the matter had already settled itself somewhere deeper than words. They walked together without speaking after that, boots pressing into dust that had not seen rain in weeks, the wind carrying the dry scent of sage and distant cattle. His place sat a mile out, maybe more, a small spread of land that asked for little and gave even less, but it was enough, always had been. As they reached the gate, the wood creaked in that familiar way, and for the first time since morning, Ethan felt something shift inside him that was not tension, not weight, but a quiet kind of certainty. She paused at the entrance, fingers brushing the post where years of weather had carved its story into the grain, and from beneath the edge of her sleeve, something caught the light, a small piece of silver wrapped around stone, worn smooth by time. Ethan noticed it without meaning to, the way it moved when she did, not decoration, not ornament, but something carried with purpose. She followed his gaze, then closed her hand over it. Not hiding it, just holding it closer, like a memory not meant for sharing yet. The wind picked up then, just enough to stir the dust along the ridge beyond his land, and Ethan squinted into the distance, seeing nothing clear, only movement too far to name, too early to matter. But something in the air had changed, subtle, like the land itself had taken notice. Behind them, Red Hollow sat quiet, too quiet for a town that had just drawn a line, and ahead of them, the open country stretched wide, carrying with it the kind of silence that did not stay empty for long. The night came down slow over Ethan Cole's land, not with comfort but with that wide, empty quiet that made every small sound carry farther than it should, and the two of them moved through it like strangers learning the shape of the same silence. The cabin was nothing more than wood and memory, boards worn smooth by years of weather, a lantern hanging crooked by the door, and inside, the faint scent of leather, dust, and something older that refused to leave. Ethan lit the lamp without a word, the flame catching after a moment, and casting long shadows that stretched across the walls like they had something to say but chose not to. She stepped inside carefully, not hesitant, just aware, the way someone steps into a place that does not belong to them yet. He poured water into a tin cup, set it on the table, and slid it toward her, the gesture simple, unspoken. And she accepted it with a small nod that carried more weight than most words ever could. Outside, the wind shifted again, brushing against the cabin like it was testing the edges of something new, and Ethan found himself glancing toward the window without knowing why. Only that the land did not feel as empty as it had that morning. She stood near the table, turning the cup slowly in her hands, and for a moment the silver at her wrist caught the lantern light again, that same small piece he had noticed before, but now closer, clearer. The stone set in it carrying a dull blue glow that did not come from the flame. Ethan leaned against the wall, arms loose at his sides, watching without staring, the way a man watches a storm far off on the horizon, knowing it might change direction, knowing it might not. "That town," she said after a while, voice low, steady. "It has already decided its story." Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose, something between agreement and resignation. "Towns do that," he answered. "Easier than thinking." She lifted her gaze then, meeting his fully this time, and there was something different in it now, not just stillness, but depth, like water you could not see the bottom of even in daylight. "And you?" she asked, not accusing, not curious, just certain. "What story have you decided?" The question settled between them, heavier than it should have been, and Ethan did not answer right away, because out here, answers had a way of becoming promises whether you meant them to or not. Instead, he pushed off the wall and stepped toward the door, opening it just enough to let the night air slip in, cool and carrying that same distant movement he had felt earlier. On the ridge, barely visible in the dark, shapes moved where there should have been nothing, not close, not yet, but they're all the same. Ethan's jaw tightened just a fraction, not fear, just recognition, the kind that comes when something long set in motion finally begins to show itself. Behind him, She did not move, did not ask, as if she already knew what he was seeing without needing to look. The lantern flickered once, twice, and for a moment the light dimmed just enough that the silver at her wrist seemed to hold its own glow, quiet, steady, like it had been waiting. Ethan closed the door slowly, the wood settling back into place with a soft, final sound, and when he turned back toward her, the air in the room felt different, no longer empty, no longer uncertain, but filled with something neither of them had spoken yet. Outside, the wind carried on across the open land, brushing over the hills, over the ridge where figures stood without stepping forward, and into the sleeping town behind them, where no one knew yet that the line they had drawn that morning had already begun to shift. Morning did not arrive all at once. It crept in slow across the land, pale light stretching over the hills like it was careful not to disturb something already waiting there. And Ethan Cole was awake before the sun cleared the ridge, sitting at the edge of the porch with his elbows on his knees, listening, not to birds, not to wind, but to that absence of sound that meant the world was holding its breath, behind him. The cabin door opened without a creak, and she stepped out into the early light, her presence as quiet as it had been the night before, but no longer uncertain. She had chosen to stay, and that choice settled between them like something real, something that could not be undone by distance or doubt. Ethan did not turn right away, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the faint outline of riders still marked the ridge, unmoving, patient, like they were not waiting for permission, only for time. They were there all night, he said. Finally, voice low, more statement than warning, she stepped beside him, following his gaze, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence filled with understanding that did not need words. "They are not here for you," she said, calm, certain, and there was no fear in it, only truth. Ethan let out a slow breath, nodding once, because he had already known that, even before she said it, the way a man knows when a storm is passing near but not over him. Down in the distance, Red Hollow began to stir, thin lines of smoke rising from chimneys, doors opening, people stepping out into a morning that felt no different to them yet, though something had already shifted beyond what they could see. A wagon rolled past the far road, slower than usual, the driver glancing toward Ethan's land before quickly looking away, as if seeing too much might tie him to something he did not want to be part of. "They will come," she said after a moment, her hand resting lightly against the wooden post, fingers brushing the grain like she was reading something written there long ago. Ethan stood then, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders, his boots settling into the dirt with quiet certainty. "Then we will meet them," he answered, not as a challenge, not as defiance, but as fact, the kind that did not ask for approval. She looked at him again, and this time there was something else in her eyes, not just depth, but recognition, like she had been searching for a line in the world and had finally found it standing in front of her. The silver at her wrist caught the morning light, brighter now, the stone holding that same steady color, and for a moment the air around them felt charged, not with danger, but with something older. Something that had been set in motion long before either of them had stepped into this place. Down below, the town moved a little faster now, more people gathering, more eyes turning toward the edge of the land where Ethan's cabin stood, curiosity pulling them closer even as caution held them back. The sheriff appeared near the main road, hands resting on his belt, posture straight but uncertain, watching the ridge the same way Ethan had been watching it since before sunrise. And then, finally, it happened, not with noise, not with urgency, but with movement so simple it carried more weight than any shout could have. One rider stepped forward from the line on the hill, then another, then a third, descending slowly, deliberately, their silhouettes growing clearer in the rising light, not rushing, not hiding, just coming. Ethan did not reach for anything, did not step back, did not speak, he only stood there, beside her. The same way he had in the middle of that street, hand steady at his side, presence unshaken, and as the riders drew closer, the space between the cabin and the town seemed to narrow, not in distance, but in meaning, like every choice made the day before was now walking toward its answer, one quiet step at a time. They did not ride like men in a hurry, and that was what made the town uneasy, because speed meant fear, and fear was something people understood, but this was something else. Ethan Cole stood with the morning light at his back, the sun just high enough to cast long shadows across the dirt, and beside him she remained still, her presence no longer out of place on that land. As if the ground itself had accepted her long before the town ever could, the riders came down the slope one by one. Not forming a line, not breaking into it either, just moving with the kind of quiet order that did not need to be shown to be known. Their horses stepped carefully, hooves pressing into dry earth without haste, without sound beyond what was necessary, and as they drew closer, the details began to show: leather worn by miles, cloth marked by weather, faces steady, unreadable, eyes that took in everything without needing to linger. Ethan felt the weight of it then, not threat, not challenge, but presence, something that filled the space without pushing against it. Down in Red Hollow, people had gathered near the edge of the road, keeping their distance but not enough to pretend they were not watching, their voices gone now, replaced by that same silence that had followed Ethan the day before. The sheriff stood at the front of them, posture tight, gaze shifting between the riders and the man he had warned just hours earlier. And for the first time since anyone could remember, he did not step forward to speak. The first rider reached the fence and stopped, not 10 yards from where Ethan stood, and for a moment nothing happened, no words, no movement, just the space between two worlds holding steady. Then the rider dismounted, slow, deliberate, boots meeting the ground with a quiet certainty that carried farther than any shout. Ethan did not move, did not reach for anything, did not even shift his weight, he only watched. Because something told him this was not his moment to act. The man walked forward alone, each step measured, his eyes never leaving the woman beside Ethan, and when he stopped, close enough now that the details of his face could be seen, the lines shaped by years and decisions, he did something that Red Hollow had not expected, not even in its quietest fears. He lowered his head, not deeply, not dramatically, just enough to be clear, enough to carry meaning that did not need explanation. The air seemed to still completely then, even the wind holding back like it did. Not want to interrupt. Behind him, the other riders remained mounted, unmoving, watching not with tension, but with something closer to acknowledgement. Ethan felt it shift through him, that understanding that had been building since the moment he took her hand in the street, the realization that whatever choice he had made, it had never been his alone to carry. Beside him, she stepped forward, not past him, not away. Just forward, closing that small distance between herself and the man who had bowed, and when she lifted her hand, the silver at her wrist caught the sun fully for the first time, the stone glowing steady, undeniable. The man raised his head then, his expression unchanged, but his eyes held something that the town had never seen directed toward her, not suspicion, not judgment, but respect, deep and certain. And behind them, on the edge of everything they thought they understood, Red Hollow stood silent, watching the meaning of the word unwanted change right in front of them without a single voice daring to name it. No one in Red Hollow had ever seen a man lower his head like that without being forced, and that was what unsettled them most, not the riders, not the number of them, but the choice inside that single motion. Ethan Cole felt it settle into the ground beneath his boots, a quiet shift that did not make noise but changed everything it touched, and for the first time since this began, he understood that what stood beside him was not someone the world had cast aside, but someone the world had failed to recognize. The man who had bowed straightened slowly, his gaze lifting not to Ethan, not to the town, but to her alone, and when he spoke, his voice carried low and steady, shaped by distance and time. "You were found sooner than we feared." And though the words were simple, they landed with a weight that reached all the way back to the street where she had stood alone. She answered him without hesitation, her voice just as calm, just as certain. "I was not lost." And there was no challenge in it, only truth, the kind that does not ask to be believed. Ethan remained still, listening, because this was not a conversation meant for interruption, not by him, not by anyone who had not walked the path that led to this moment. Behind the first rider, the others began to dismount, one by one, not in a show of force, not in preparation, but in acknowledgement, boots touching the earth with the same quiet certainty. Heads inclining just enough to mirror the respect that had already been given. The distance between them and the cabin closed without tension, without urgency, like a tide moving and that had no need to rush because it would arrive all the same. Down the slope, the people of Red Hollow shifted, some stepping back, some leaning forward, all of them trying to understand what they were seeing without the words to shape it. The sheriff removed his hat slowly, not out of command, not out of habit, but because something in him recognized that whatever this was, it did not belong to him to control. Ethan glanced at him once, just once, and saw it there, the doubt, the realization that the lines he thought he had drawn were not lines at all, just guesses made too early. Beside him, she moved again, stepping fully into the space between Ethan and the man who had spoken, not leaving Ethan behind, but not standing behind him either, exactly where she needed to be. She lifted her hand, the silver at her wrist catching the light, and for a moment the air seemed to gather around it, not in any way that could be seen clearly, but in a way that could be felt, like heat before it rises, like rain before it falls. The man inclined his head once more, deeper this time, and the others followed, a line of quiet gestures that carried farther than any declaration. Ethan felt something loosen in his chest then, something he had not realized he had been holding since the moment he stepped into that street. And it was not relief, not pride, just a quiet understanding that the choice he had made had never been about changing the town, only about standing still long enough for the truth to arrive. And as the morning light settled fully over the land, washing the dust and wood and faces in the same steady glow, Red Hollow stood watching, not as a crowd anymore, but as witnesses, each of them seeing, in their own way, that the woman they had named Unwanted had never belonged to their judgment at all. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling over Red Hollow like something the land itself had been waiting to witness, and Ethan Cole stood in it without moving, feeling the weight of eyes not just on him, but on the space between him and her, the space where a choice had been made and now refused to be undone. The man before them stepped aside then, not as retreat, not as surrender, but as invitation. And the line of riders behind him shifted just enough to open a path that led past the cabin, past the fence, out toward the open land where the horizon stretched wider than any boundary the town had tried to draw. She did not take it, not yet. Instead, she turned slightly, her gaze moving across the gathered faces below, not searching for approval, not measuring judgment, just seeing them as they were. And for the first time since she had entered their world, it was the town that could not hold her gaze for long. A man near the front lowered his eyes, then another, then a woman who had spoken the loudest the day before took a step back without realizing it, as if distance might soften what had already been revealed. The sheriff shifted his weight, hat still in his hands, and though he said nothing, the absence of his voice carried more meaning than any command he had ever given. Ethan watched it all from where he stood, not stepping forward, not stepping back, because this was no longer a moment that required him to act, only to remain. Beside him, she lifted her hand once more, the silver at her wrist catching the full strength of the morning sun, and this time there was no mistaking it. The stone held its own light, steady, quiet, as if it had been waiting for the world to be still enough to notice. A murmur moved through the edge of the town then, not loud, not unified, but present, the sound of understanding arriving slower than fear ever had. She lowered her hand and took a single step, not toward the riders, not toward the town, but toward Ethan, closing the distance that had always been smaller than it seemed. When she spoke, it was not to the riders, not to the sheriff, but to him, her voice carrying only far enough for him to hear. "You stood when there was no reason to." And Ethan felt that same quiet weight return, not as burden, but as something he would carry without question. He nodded once, the motion simple, because there was nothing else to add that would not lessen it. The man who had first bowed watched this exchange without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his presence shifting just enough to show that whatever had been decided here, it had been accepted. Behind him, the others remained still, not waiting anymore, just present, like the land itself when it recognizes something true. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying the scent of dust and distance across the space that had once divided them, and for the first time since morning, it did not feel like a boundary. Down below, Red Hollow did not move forward, did not speak, did not try to reclaim what it had already lost. It simply stood, watching the shape of its own certainty dissolve without force, without argument, without a single raised voice. And in that quiet, where nothing dramatic had happened and yet everything had changed, Ethan understood something he had not known when he stepped into the street the day before. That sometimes the strongest thing a man could do was not to fight, not to convince, but to remain exactly where he chose to stand until the truth found him there. The moment did not end, it unfolded, slow and deliberate, like a story that refused to rush its own meaning, and Ethan Cole felt it in the way the air settled around them, no longer tight, no longer waiting for something to break, but holding steady, as if the land itself had decided this was enough. The riders did not move forward again, and they did not turn away either, they simply stood where they were. A quiet line drawn not to divide, but to witness, and in that stillness there was no demand, no expectation, only presence. She remained beside Ethan, close enough that the space between them no longer felt like distance at all, and when she looked toward the open path that had been offered, it was not with hesitation, but with understanding, as if she had always known it would be there, just not when. The man who had first bowed stepped back once more, giving that path its full shape, and though he did not speak again, the meaning was clear in the way he held himself, not asking her to follow, not urging, only making it possible. Down below, Red Hollow shifted again, but this time it was not fear that moved them, it was something quieter, something harder to name, the slow arrival of awareness that what they had judged had never belonged to them in the first place. A child stepped forward near the edge of the road, small boots pressing into the dust, eyes wide not with fear, but with the kind of curiosity that had not yet learned to divide the world into sides. And for a moment no one pulled him back. The sheriff watched it happen and said nothing, his hand resting loosely at his side, hat still held low, as if he understood that this was not something he could command even if he tried. Ethan turned his head slightly, just enough to see her without fully breaking his stance, and there was a question there, not spoken, not pressed, only present, the kind that waits without needing an answer. She met it with a look that carried both distance and closeness, a quiet recognition of the line they had walked together. And for a moment the world seemed to narrow to just that. Two people standing in the same place for the same reason, even if either of them had named it. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying the faint sound of leather and reins, of breath and earth, of things that belonged to movement but had chosen stillness instead. She lowered her gaze briefly, her fingers brushing the silver at her wrist, and when she looked up again, there was no uncertainty left in her eyes. She stepped forward, one pace toward the open path, then stopped, not because she could not go on, but because she chose not to yet. She turned back, not to the riders, not to the town, but to Ethan, and in that turn was something no one else could fully understand, not obligation, not debt, but something quieter, something rooted in that single moment when he had taken her hand without asking what it would cost. Ethan did not move to follow, did not step away, he simply stood, steady as before. Because whatever came next did not need him to lead it. Behind them, Red Hollow remained where it was, no longer pressing forward, no longer pulling away, caught in that space between what it had believed and what it was beginning to see, and out beyond the fence, the open land waited, wide and patient, holding a path that was no longer about leaving or staying, but about choosing, and for the first time, that choice did not belong to fear, or to the town, or even to the riders who had come for her. It belonged only to her, and to what she would decide to carry forward. From the man who had stood beside her when no one else would. She did not take the next step right away, and that was what made it matter, because choice, real choice, does not rush itself for anyone watching. The wind moved gently across the open land, brushing against the hem of her dress, carrying the quiet weight of everything that had led to this moment, and Ethan Cole stood where he had always stood, not closer, not farther, just present, the same man who had stepped forward when there had been no reason to accept that it felt right. She turned fully toward him then, not halfway, not uncertain. And for a moment the world narrowed again, the riders, the town, the distance between them all fading into something softer, something that did not demand attention. Her eyes held his, steady and clear, and there was no question left in them now, only understanding, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be known. She reached up slowly, fingers brushing the silver at her wrist, and with a careful motion she slipped it free, the small stone catching the sunlight one last time before resting in her palm. Ethan did not move, but something in his expression shifted, not surprise, not expectation, just a quiet awareness that whatever came next would not be something he could change. She stepped closer, closing that final inch of space between them, and took his hand again, but this time it was her choice, her movement, her decision carried forward without hesitation. She placed the bracelet into his palm, closing his fingers gently around it, not as a gift, not as a payment, but as something shared, something left behind without being lost. So you remember, she said softly, her voice carrying only to him, and Ethan felt the weight of the stone settle into his hand, warmer than it should have been, like it held more than metal and memory. He nodded once, because some things do not need more than that. She let go then, not abruptly, not reluctantly, just as simply as she had taken his hand the day before, and turned back toward the open path. This time, she walked forward without stopping. Her steps steady, measured, each one carrying her farther from the line the town had drawn and closer to the one she had chosen for herself. The riders did not close around her, did not guide her, they simply moved with her, their presence no longer something arriving, but something returning. The man who had bowed fell into step just behind her, not leading, not following, but near enough to show that whatever she was, wherever she was going, she did not walk it alone. Ethan remained where he was, the bracelet in his hand, watching without reaching, because he understood now that holding on was not the same as standing beside someone, and sometimes the truest thing a man could do was to let the path unfold without stepping into it. Down below, Red Hollow stood silent, no one calling out, no one stepping forward, because there was nothing left to claim, nothing left to argue, only the quiet truth of what they had witnessed settling into them one by one. The sheriff placed his hat back on his head slowly, not as authority, but as habit, and even that seemed different now, smaller somehow. The child who had stepped forward earlier remained at the edge of the road, watching the figures move across the land with eyes that had not yet learned to turn away. The sun climbed higher, washing everything in the same steady light, the cabin, the fence, the town, the open hills beyond, and in that light, nothing stood above anything else, nothing claimed more worth than the next. Ethan opened his hand slightly, looking down at the small piece of silver resting there, and for the first time since this had begun, he allowed himself a breath that was not held back by expectation or doubt. Out on the horizon, the figures grew smaller, blending into the land they belonged to, until they were no longer shapes at all, just part of the distance. And in the quiet that followed, where no words were spoken and no victory was claimed, something remained, not loud, not visible, but certain that out here, on land that did not care for names or judgments, being chosen, even once, was enough to change everything that came after.